and I'm really glad to be here today to talk to you about feminist care ethics. So this paper is based on a chapter that was written almost 2 years ago. This is the time frame of book chapters for a book that is edited by Hilda Stefansson and Emiliano Trere. It's coming out, I think, next month. And I think both Stefania and Lina are there. And this is how this panel kind of started, as thinking around data practices and feminist approaches to data practices, basically. This is how it was submitted. So I wrote this chapter after attending a talk at the Sussex Centre for Digital Humanities in November 2017. And the talk was by Maria de la Puig de la Bellacasa, and she presented there her then really newly published book, Matters of Care, Speculative Ethics in More Than Human Worlds, where she attempts to connect a feminist materialist tradition of critical thinking of care, on care, with debates on more than human ontologies and ecological practices. And at this point, I had just started writing my feminist data studies book, which is due to come out sometime at the end of next year. And, oops, where are we? And at that point, there was nothing really written about feminist care ethics and data. Now there is more, and I'm referencing that new work that has come out in the meantime. And I was very much intrigued by Maria's talk. So I asked the panel at that point, and it became kind of a task for me to think about what would an orientation of care entail for data science, and how could I connect feminist materialist critical thinking on care with debates about data practices. So in the book chapter, I trace the relevance of practice theory, and particularly Chauve's social practice theory, for understanding datafication from a feminist perspective. And I use the notion of data practice to include a range of practices that may not be deemed or intended to be political, explicitly political in some way or another, like data activism, for example. And this allows us, I think, to analyze data politics and power relations in seemingly mundane, everyday settings and often really normalized activities. So my argument is that the notion of care, as developed in feminist science and technology studies by de la Bellacasa, but also by others, can be a very productive analytical and critical approach when scrutinizing the manifestation of power relations in data practices. And as I'm going to show today, approaching data power in everyday data practices as matters of care allows us to account for their affective, embodied, and material elements. And these include the habitually devalued human labor of data users, of activists, of people working in advocacy, of producers of data, consumers, and citizens. So although data justice conceptualizations, as developed by Lynette Taylor and Lina, who are here today, are invaluable, and many others, of course, are invaluable for understanding data and power, I argue that the notion of care inserts particularity and empathy in social justice frameworks. And this focus on materiality, local specificity and embodiment, but also a research commitment to unsettling the power relations of race, class, gender, ability in datafied worlds are really essential for data science and critical data studies, I think. And I'm particularly intrigued by the concept of epistemic responsibility developed by Code in 2015 to think about how caring and deep investment are not incompatible with doing research. They can actually work together. Why, you may say, why focus on practices, and what might a practice-based understanding of data entail? I think there are good reasons for focusing on data practices, because we know how critical data studies and other disciplines have approached critical questions around data, but mainly have considered the production and employment of data, and there's usually lots of theorization about data. We are in Data Power conference. I know we are here to theorize data. However, I think there is a lot of value in thinking about practices, and Judy Bachman has explained in her very early accounts of science, technology, and gender how technologies are both what people do and what they know. They form part of human activities and practices, and they're not just textual or material. And after all, data do not discriminate. It's people who use data and pose particular questions and formulate these questions and find the patterns between data. So data-related practices implicate human actors from a variety of positions. They can come from different identities. They can be users, producers, consumers, and citizens. And they engage in social practices that are not always measurable activities. So practices that are experiential and linked to real-life specificities. In a previous paper, for example, and this is also coming as a case study in the forthcoming Feminist Data Studies book, I examined the use of fertility and period tracking apps as an embodied data practice, which, however, when we observe the categories of data collection by apps such as Clue, for example, it becomes disembodied and definitely considerably reductive. And there I talk also about the lack of representation of queer bodies and experiences, but importantly, how human bodies and embodied experiences are oversimplified, while the particularities, which are contextual and shaped by these intersectional conditions that Catherine also talked about earlier, are flattened to help their data categorization and classification. So the notion of care here attempts to stand against this kind of flattening of the constructed, embodied, situated time specificity and place specificity of data. And as Zagura and her colleagues have written in a paper that also works around the notions of care and data science, more recently, careful data science is attentive to both scientific rigor and the situated knowledge of those most affected by data-based policy decisions. And their contribution in this debate is particularly relevant because they apply this logic of care in the practice of data science for the social good. So they talk about the advocacy in particular, policies and initiatives that try to improve well-being. Affordable housing is one of the examples that they use in their paper, and other issues of social concern. So that's also relevant to the keynote this morning and the question that was posed during that time. So care practices and data that apply in these settings have to do with data collection and cleaning as well, data management, the repair work. They also can apply for thinking around maker spaces and also collaborative data work. And this is from the work of Baker and Karadzi and also Amanda Meng. This is very recent, it just came out. I'd like to go back to talk a little bit about the concept of epistemic responsibility that I mentioned earlier. So according to Code, who writes about care, concern, and advocacy, particularities and real-world specificities matter epistemically as well. And she's talking about how we can try to know responsibly, to assemble scientific knowledge with care, and to combine this with thinking compassionately, so being deeply invested and also acting to foster this kind of social justice. So Della Bellacasa describes what an ethos of care in studying science and technology may entail. She draws from Latour and Haraway, and she argues that we need to care for the technologies that we are critical about in order to remain responsible for their social justice impact and to really affect their use, no matter how passionate, how angry and critical we may be. We still need to care about these technologies. So a framework of care through this kind of feminist ethics lens helps us understand the political potential of connections and situations in data practices of people who occupy these kinds of diversity of identities. So turning to matters of care, says Della Bellacasa, instead of matters of fact or a priori notions of social justice, suggests that we make of them, I quote, what is needed to generate more caring relationships. And I quote again, care connotes attention and worry for those who can be harmed by an assemblage, but whose voices are less valued, as are their concerns and need for care. For example, trees and flowers, babies in prams whose noses stroll at the level of SUVs, exhaust pipes, cyclists, or older people. So what are the premises of how to adopt a care perspective in the production of knowledge and scholarship, or a critical care practice as a researcher? How can we seek to incite our readers to care about the stuff that we're writing about? And I'm going to draw from this very formative kind of process that these people write about intersectional feminist ethics of care. So both Gillis Aldred and Meng and her colleagues, they talk about, first of all, recognizing intersectionality of oppression and naming subjects in a way that recognizes their colonial experiences. The second process they talk about is facilitating practices of care through action research. And if it's not action research, they talk generally about research that enables some kind of transformational change for those who participate in it. And thirdly, deconstructing or in some way undermining knowledge structure, so designing for and with the oppressed populations. I'll come back to this in the next slide. So Luca and Millet also talk specifically about research practices, and they have a long list of very interesting and very valuable questions that we may ask ourselves as researchers in that field. So, and I have just selected these 3 sets of questions, and I've rephrased them. They don't appear exactly like this. So the first one is, what right do I have to be in this kind of terrain? Why am I here? Why am I doing this work? And from which stance or positionality do we undertake our research, and with which privileges and vulnerabilities? Are we participants as well as researchers in this? And how can this research be collaborative and useful for the persons whose experiences are being scrutinized? Is collaborative research design possible in this? And another one that I found in a report by the More Than Code people who was they produced this with the Tech for Social Justice project. They talked about adopting co-design methods and concrete community accountability mechanisms. How can that work? I'm talking a little bit more about this in the afternoon talk. So what I'm drawing in this chapter that was written before the frameworks that these people developed in the previous slides are 3 considerations for an ethos of care when analyzing data practices. And the first one is, what are the institutional settings that frame the questions to be asked, and the data to be collected, and who is represented or non-represented in this data? I think there is a trap about talking about lack of representation. There is a recent paper by Hoffman, and she kind of critiques Moala Wabi and her colleagues about talking about the missing data in face recognition data sets. So she's kind of raising this issue about, is the issue basically the missing data, or is it, what institutional context these are going to be used in? Secondly, what kinds of invisible data labor and care practices, such as data management, cleaning, and all that, and the data burden for the communities that are necessary for this work, and who benefits from this labor? And thirdly, what is the role of the data practices under investigation in reproducing or challenging existing social relations within these changing systems that we are all examining in our work? So I leave you with this kind of provocation to implement a care perspective in the production of knowledge and scholarship, or a critical care practice as a researcher, and to kind of try to think about how to further challenge to incite our readers to care. And I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.